October 530 BC, the Zagros Mountains, Persian Empire. A team of royal tomb builders descends into the newly constructed underground chamber beneath what will become the Pasargadae necropolis. Their torches flicker against limestone walls, casting shadows that dance like specters. But it's not the darkness that makes their hands tremble. It's the 27 horses, standing perfectly upright in individual stone stalls, eyes still open, mouths frozen in silent screams, each magnificent Arabian stallion positioned as if NG changed. Cyrus, now in his 60s, decided to lead a campaign against the Massagetæ, a fierce nomadic tribe, northeast of the empire's borders. The Massagetæ queen, Tomiris, had refused his marriage proposal, a diplomatic insult that demanded a military response. Despite warnings from his advisors, despite troubling omens reported by the court magi, Cyrus marched east with his army. What happened in that campaign would shock the known world. The great Cyrus, who had never lost a battle, who had conquered every army that dared face him, was defeated and killed. According to Herodotus, Queen Tomiris herself decapitated his corpse and thrust his head into a wineskin filled with blood, declaring, "I warned you I would quench your thirst for blood, and so I shall." When news of the emperor's death reached Pasargadae, it arrived carried by one of his royal messenger horses, a gray stallion named Tigran, who had galloped non-stop for 3 days, his flanks foaming with sweat, his hooves bloodied from the rocky terrain. The horse collapsed and died in the palace courtyard moments after his rider delivered the message, as if he had held on to life just long enough to complete his final duty. This was when something shifted in the Persian court. Cyrus's son and successor, Cambyses II, immediately ordered preparations for the most elaborate funeral in history, but the planning fell largely to the court magi, the priestly caste that had served as religious advisors to the Achaemenid dynasty since its founding. These magi were Zoroastrians, followers of the prophet Zarathustra, but their beliefs were tinged with older, darker traditions from the days before Persia's rise. The chief magus was a man named Gaumata, whose influence over the young Cambyses had been growing steadily. Ancient texts describe him as gaunt and intense, a man who claimed to commune directly with Ahura Mazda, the supreme god. Gaumata insisted that Cyrus's sudden defeat was a sign. The cosmic balance had been disrupted. The great emperor had accumulated such power, such glory, that his death had created a tear in the fabric of the universe itself. To restore balance, Gaumata argued, Cyrus must enter the afterlife with the same power he wielded in life, not just symbolically but literally. His servants, his possessions, his instruments of power, all must accompany him, fully intact and functioning, into the world beyond. The royal court, still reeling from the shock of Cyrus's death, grappling with the uncertainty of succession and the threat of rebellion in distant provinces, was susceptible to Gaumata's vision. Fear makes people accept the unacceptable. Grief makes them rationalize the irrational. And so, as summer turned to autumn in 530 BC, as Cyrus's body was brought back to Pasargadae for entombment in the great limestone sepulchre that had been prepared for him, a plan was set in motion that would require the ultimate sacrifice from those who had served him most faithfully. The 27 royal messenger horses would join their master in death, but not through any merciful poison or quick blade to the throat. The Magi had decreed that the horses must remain standing, fully alert and ready to carry their master's commands in the afterlife. They would be entombed alive in individual stalls, positioned as if awaiting their riders, a process that would take hours, perhaps days, as the animals slowly suffocated in the sealed chamber. The stable masters who cared for these horses were horrified. These men had raised many of these stallions from foals, had trained them, groomed them, treated their injuries, celebrated their successes. The horses knew them, trusted them, and now they were being asked to lead their companions to a death of unimaginable cruelty. Several stable masters refused. Historical records, fragmentary as they are, mention that at least 3 men were executed for their defiance, their bodies thrown from the cliffs near Pasargadae as a warning. Others, faced with the choice between their own family's safety and the horses' lives, reluctantly complied. What none of them realized yet was that the horses were not the only ones who would be asked to make this ultimate sacrifice. The tomb builders, the stable masters, the servants who had served Cyrus most intimately, all of them had been marked for death as well. Gaumata had convinced Cambyses that secrecy was paramount. The exact location and contents of the tomb must remain unknown, lest grave robbers desecrate it, and the only way to guarantee silence was to ensure that everyone who knew the tomb's secrets never left the mountain. Incident 1. The selection ceremony 3 weeks before the official funeral. The stable masters of the Royal Messenger Corps received an unusual summons. They were to present all 27 horses to the chief Magus Gaumata for what was described as a blessing ceremony. This wasn't entirely unprecedented. Religious rituals surrounding the emperor's death were expected, but something about the order troubled the head stable master, a veteran horseman named Artabanus. Artabanus had served Cyrus for 30 years. He knew each of these horses personally, their temperaments, their quirks, their histories. There was Persepolis, the black stallion who had once carried news of a rebellion in Bactria, completing the journey in record time. Wind Dancer, the dappled mare who could navigate mountain passes that terrified other horses. Shadow Runner, who had served as Cyrus's personal mount during the conquest of Lydia. The ceremony took place at dawn in the main courtyard of Pasargadae. The Magi, dressed in their white robes, stood in a semicircle as each horse was led forward. Gaumata placed his hands on each animal's head, murmuring prayers in Old Avestan that none of the stable masters could fully understand. But it was what happened next that sent a chill through Artabanus. As each horse was blessed, a royal scribe marked its name in a leather-bound ledger and then crossed through it with red ink. When Artabanus asked what the markings meant, Gaumata smiled, a thin, cold expression that never reached his eyes. "These noble creatures have been consecrated to serve the King of Kings in the next world," he said. "They are no longer of this realm." The stable masters exchanged worried glances, but no one dared question further. To challenge the chief magus, especially during the vulnerable period of imperial succession, was to risk accusations of impiety, a crime punishable by death. But that evening, Artabanus confided his concerns to his wife, Parmes. The words the magus had used, "no longer of this realm," implied something far more permanent than a symbolic dedication. And there was something else troubling him. After the ceremony, the horses had been moved from their usual stables to a temporary enclosure near the tomb construction site in the mountains. When Artabanus asked when they would be returned, he was told simply, "They are where they need to be." Incident 2, the sealed orders 1 week later. The master tomb architect, a Greek craftsman named Dorotheos who had been hired for his expertise in underground construction, received a set of sealed orders that fundamentally changed the tomb's design. The modifications were extensive and bizarre. The original design had called for a simple burial chamber with an antechamber for offerings. The new specifications demanded something far more complex, a series of 27 vertical stone stalls, each exactly 7 feet deep, 3 feet wide, and tall enough to accommodate a full-grown horse standing upright. These stalls were to be arranged in a semicircle around the central sarcophagus chamber with narrow connecting passages between them. Most disturbing was a specific requirement: each stall must be fitted with a sliding stone door that could be operated from outside the chamber, and once closed could not be opened from within. Addition: the ventilation shafts that Dorotheos had designed to prevent moisture accumulation were to be eliminated. The tomb had to be completely sealed, airtight. Dorotheos was not a fool. He understood immediately what these modifications meant. He brought his concerns to his assistant, a young Persian mason named Bardia. "They mean to entomb living creatures," Dorotheos said quietly, showing Bardia the plans. "These specifications, they're not for statues or offerings. They're designed to hold living animals until—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Bardia was torn. He was Persian, raised in the Zoroastrian faith, taught that Cyrus was more than a king. He was a divinely appointed ruler whose conquests had been ordained by Ahura Mazda himself. If the Magi decreed that such sacrifices were necessary for the great emperor's journey to the afterlife, who was he to question? But Bardia was also a horseman. He had grown up around horses, understood their intelligence, their capacity for fear and suffering. The thought of these magnificent animals that had served the empire so faithfully, dying slowly in darkness, trapped in stone cells, it violated something fundamental in his soul. He asked Dorotheos what they should do. The Greek architect's response was pragmatic and chilling. "We build what we're paid to build. If we refuse, they'll execute us and find builders who won't refuse. At least if we do the work, we might find a way to ease their passage." It was a rationalization, and both men knew it. But it was enough to allow them to continue. Work on the modified tomb design began immediately. The construction crews, many of them prisoners and slaves, worked in rotating shifts day and night. Those who asked questions about the unusual design were reassigned or, in some cases, simply disappeared. A culture of fear had settled over the entire project. One detail that Dorotheos noted but didn't share with the authorities: the workers who were building the horse stalls were different from those constructing the main burial chamber. No single work crew saw the complete design. It was compartmentalized, as if someone wanted to ensure that no one except the lead architects understood what was being built. This suggested planning, premeditation, secrecy. Whatever was going to happen in that tomb, the authorities wanted to ensure that evidence would be minimal and witnesses few. Incident 3. The herbal preparations. 2 weeks before the funeral, the royal physicians received an unusual request from Gaumata. They were to prepare large quantities of a specific herbal mixture, a combination of valerian root, poppy extract, and several other sedating herbs. The quantities requested were enormous, far more than would be needed for any normal medicinal purpose. One of the junior physicians, a man named Mithridates, recognized this combination. It was used to calm fractious horses before difficult procedures, castration, treatment of severe injuries, anything that might cause an animal to panic and hurt itself or others. But the dosage specified in Gaumata's request was unusual. It wasn't enough to render an animal unconscious, but it was strong enough to make them docile, compliant, less likely to struggle or resist. Mithridates made the mistake of mentioning this observation to a colleague within earshot of one of Gaumata's attendants. The next day he was summoned to the chief magus's private chambers. What happened in that meeting, we know only from fragmentary accounts. Gaumata allegedly explained to Mithridates that the herbs were for a sacred ritual, that questioning the religious preparations for an emperor's funeral was tantamount to sacrilege. He reminded the young physician that his family, a wife and 2 small children, depended on his discretion. Mithridates prepared the herbs as requested, but that night he copied the formula into his personal journal, adding a note: "If what I suspect is true, may the gods forgive us all for what we are about to do." That journal, discovered centuries later during excavations near Pasargadae, provides some of the few contemporary accounts we have of these events. Incident 4, the night of questions 5 days before the funeral. Something unprecedented happened. 3 of the stable masters, including Artabanus, requested an audience with Cambyses II himself. This was an act of extraordinary courage, or extraordinary desperation. Common servants did not simply demand meetings with the emperor, but Artabanus had served Cyrus personally. He had accompanied the great emperor on campaigns, had cared for his personal mounts, had earned a degree of respect and access that few others possessed. He leveraged this history to gain entry to the palace. What transpired in that meeting was never officially recorded, but we have accounts from palace servants who overheard fragments of the conversation. Artabanus asked directly about the fate of the royal horses. He spoke of their years of service, their value to the empire, their role in maintaining the communication networks that held the vast Persian territories together. He suggested, carefully, diplomatically, that surely there were other ways to honor Cyrus's memory that didn't require the destruction of such valuable animals. He proposed that the horses could be dedicated in Cyrus's name, used to train the next generation of messenger animals, kept as living monuments to the emperor's vision. Cambyses' response was telling. According to the servants' accounts, the young emperor seemed uncertain, even sympathetic, but before he could respond, Gaumata, who had apparently been summoned to the meeting, intervened. The chief magus spoke of cosmic balance, of the debts the living owed to the dead, of the sacred duty to ensure that Cyrus entered the afterlife with his power intact. He spoke of omens and prophecies, of disasters that would befall the empire if proper rituals were not observed. His words carried the weight of religious authority, backed by centuries of tradition and the unquestionable power of the priestly caste. And then Gaumata said something that would later be remembered as prophetic. Those who question the will of the gods often find themselves answering to the gods directly. The audience ended. Artabanus and the other stable masters were dismissed, but not reassigned. They would continue their duties, caring for the horses right up until the funeral. As they left the palace, Artabanus turned to his companions and said something that was recorded by one of the guards. "We are dead men, we just don't know it yet." He was more right than he could have imagined, because in 3 days' time, when those 27 horses were led into the mountain tomb, they wouldn't be going alone. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Let's discover what happens next in this haunting chapter of ancient history. October 27, 530 BC, the day of Cyrus the Great's funeral. The ceremony begins at dawn, as priests and nobles gather at the limestone tomb that has been constructed at the base of the Zagros Mountains. The structure is impressive, a stepped pyramid design that will, in later centuries, inspire countless imitators. But the real tomb, the actual burial chamber, lies beneath, carved deep into the living rock of the mountain. Cyrus's body, preserved through a combination of myrrh, cedar oil, and wax, is borne on a golden bier by 12 of his most trusted generals. The procession moves slowly, accompanied by the mournful chanting of the Magi and the sound of thousands of mourners beating their chests in ritual grief. But 50 yards behind the main procession, something else is happening, something witnessed by only a select few. The 27 royal messenger horses are being led toward the tomb entrance. Each stallion is handled by 2 stable masters, and each has been given a dose of the herbal mixture prepared by the royal physicians. The animals are calm but not unconscious. Their eyes are clear, their heads erect, their gaits steady. To an observer unfamiliar with horses, they might appear normal, even eager. But Artabanus can see the truth. The horses are docile not because they're unafraid, but because they've been chemically robbed of their natural panic responses. Their instincts have been dulled, their survival reflexes suppressed. When they balk at the tomb entrance, it's a slow, confused resistance rather than the explosive flight response that healthy horses would display. The tomb's entrance is a steep ramp descending into darkness. The horses are led down in single file, their hooves making hollow sounds on the stone. At the bottom, the space opens into a high-ceilinged chamber illuminated by dozens of oil lamps. This is the antechamber, where offerings and treasures have been arranged. Gold, silver, precious gems, weapons, artworks from every corner of the empire. But beyond this chamber, through a narrow corridor, lies the heart of the tomb, and this is where the true horror begins. The burial chamber is circular, approximately 40 feet in diameter. At its center sits the sarcophagus, a massive stone box inscribed with cuneiform text praising Cyrus's accomplishments. And surrounding this central monument, carved into the chamber walls, are the 27 vertical stalls. Each stall is a stone cell, precisely dimensioned to hold a horse standing upright. The floors are level but unforgiving rock. There are no feeding troughs, no water containers, because these are not meant to be temporary enclosures. The stalls are fitted with stone doors that slide horizontally across the opening, operated by a lever system that can only be accessed from outside. As each horse is led to its designated stall, the stable masters perform their final duties. They brush the animals' coats one last time, check their hooves, whisper words of comfort and apology into their ears. Several of the men are openly weeping. Shadowrunner, Cyrus's personal mount, recognizes Artabanus, the great black stallion, who has carried the emperor through countless battles, who has galloped across deserts and mountains and through enemy arrows, nuzzles Artabanus's shoulder with his soft muzzle, completely trusting. This is the moment when Artabanus breaks. He turns to Gaumata, who stands supervising the proceedings with cold efficiency, and makes one final plea. "Please," he says, his voice cracking, "give them poison. Let them die quickly, painlessly. Don't make them suffer like this." Gaumata's response is delivered without emotion. Suffering is transformation. Pain is the doorway between worlds. They must be fully conscious when they cross over, or they cannot serve in the next realm. It's religious justification for cruelty, and everyone in that chamber knows it, but no one else dares speak. The horses are positioned in their stalls. Each one is fitted with ceremonial bridles decorated with gold and silver, as if they're being prepared for a royal parade, rather than a horrific death. Their reins are looped over hooks set into the walls above their heads, keeping them facing forward, unable to turn around or lie down. And then, as Cyrus's body is finally carried into the chamber and placed within the sarcophagus, Gaumata gives the order. The stone doors begin to slide shut. The horses, dulled by drugs but not entirely unaware, begin to react. Some whinny, sharp, questioning sounds that echo off the stone walls. Others stamp their hooves, a nervous rhythm that will continue for hours. Shadowrunner, in his stall directly adjacent to the sarcophagus, releases a sound that every person in that chamber will remember for the rest of their short lives. A deep, mournful cry that sounds almost human in its despair. As each stone door slots into place with a grinding thud, sealing another horse in dark. The stable masters are corralled by Gaumata's guards. They're told they'll be needed for additional rituals, that their presence is required for the final blessings. This is when Artabanus realizes the full scope of the horror. They're not leaving this tomb either. The guards force the stable masters, along with the tomb workers who constructed the chamber, into the antechamber. There are 37 men total, skilled craftsmen, loyal servants, men who have families waiting for them above ground. Men who now understand they've been marked for death from the beginning. Some try to run. The narrow corridor leading back to the entrance becomes a scene of panic and violence. Guards with bronze spears block the way. Men are struck down, their blood staining the limestone floor. Others plead, offering bribes, invoking their years of service, begging for mercy. Dorotheos, the Greek architect, doesn't beg. He simply sits against the wall, his head in his hands, and says in his native Greek, "I knew. Gods forgive me, I knew." The entrance corridor is sealed with a massive stone slab that requires 8 men to move. As it slides into place, cutting off the last rays of sunlight, the tomb is plunged into a darkness broken only by the few remaining oil lamps that will burn for perhaps 6 hours before exhausting their fuel. The men trapped inside can hear the horses. The whinnying has grown more frantic as the effects of the sedatives begin to wear off. The sound of hooves striking stone echoes through the chambers, the animals kicking at their enclosures, trying desperately to escape. But the stalls are engineered too well. The stone doors are too thick, too heavy, too perfectly fitted. And now, in the darkness, with the air already growing stale and thin, the trapped men begin to understand the timeline of their deaths. The horses, larger and requiring more oxygen, will die first, slowly suffocating over the course of hours, perhaps a full day. The men will die more slowly, their agony drawn out over days as the oxygen depletes and carbon dioxide accumulates. Bardia, the young Persian mason who helped construct these death chambers, begins to scream. His cries join the horses' distress, creating a symphony of suffering that reverberates through the stone chambers. Artabanus, still holding Shadowrunner's embroidered lead rope, finds himself sitting against the stone door of the Stallions' stall. He can hear the great horse on the other side, the scraping of hooves, the harsh breathing, the occasional strike of skull against stone as the animal tosses its head. He speaks to the horse through the stone, words of comfort and apology, as if the animal can understand, as if it matters, as if anything matters anymore. "I'm sorry," he whispers. "I'm so sorry." In the chamber beyond, from the tomb entrance, there are sounds, chanting, prayers, the final rites being performed by the Magi. And then those sounds grow distant, fade away. The funeral party is leaving. The tomb is being sealed completely, all evidence of the entrance buried under stones and earth. Within a generation, its exact location will be forgotten, the truth of what happened here lost to history. The oil lamps begin to gutter out one by one. The darkness becomes absolute. And in that darkness the dying continues, horses and men together, trapped in an elaborate grave, suffocating slowly in the name of religious duty and imperial tradition. The last sound anyone in that tomb hears is Shadowrunner, Cyrus the Great's loyal mount, releasing a final defeated breath that sounds like a sigh. What emerged in the weeks and months following the funeral was a conspiracy of silence so complete that it took nearly 2,400 years for the truth to be partially uncovered. In the immediate aftermath, the families of the missing stable masters and tomb workers began asking questions. Where were their husbands, fathers, and sons? They had gone to participate in the emperor's funeral and never returned. Official records from the period, fragmentary as they are, show that these families were told various stories. Some men had been reassigned to distant provinces. Others had chosen to retire to remote monasteries. Still others had been accused of crimes and executed. But one wife refused to accept these explanations. Parmes, Artabanus's widow, knew her husband would never have abandoned his family without word. She began making inquiries, carefully at first, then with growing boldness. She spoke to other families, compared stories, and realized that the pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Every man who had worked closely on Cyrus's tomb construction, or who had cared for the royal horses, was now gone. What happened to Parmes is one of the minor tragedies embedded within this larger horror. 3 months after the funeral, she disappeared. Her own family reported her missing, but no investigation was ever conducted. The unspoken message was clear: asking questions about the emperor's funeral was dangerous. The empire demanded silence, and those who couldn't provide it were removed. The official story, promoted by Gaumata and supported by the young emperor Cambyses II, was that Cyrus had been given the most elaborate funeral in history, with honors befitting his status as the greatest ruler the world had ever known. The exact location of his tomb was kept secret to prevent desecration by grave robbers, a claim that wasn't entirely false, though it omitted the more sinister reasons for such secrecy. But within the Persian court, whispers circulated. Servants spoke of strange sounds heard from the mountains on the night of the funeral, animal cries that seemed to last for days. Priests who had participated in the ceremonies developed mysterious ailments. Several died within months, their deaths attributed to divine displeasure, though more likely caused by guilt and trauma. Most significantly, Gaumata himself disappeared less than a year after Cyrus's funeral. Historical records indicate that when Cambyses departed for Egypt to continue his father's imperial expansion, Gaumata seized power in a coup, claiming to be Cambyses' younger brother Bardia, who had actually been secretly murdered. This false Gaumata ruled for 7 months before being overthrown and killed by a conspiracy of Persian nobles led by Darius, who would become the next great Persian emperor. Darius's own account of these events, recorded in the famous Behistun inscription, mentions Gaumata only as a usurper and fraud, making no reference to his role as chief magus or his involvement in Cyrus's funeral. This seems deliberate, an attempt to erase Gaumata from history, to ensure that his name would be associated only with treachery and not with the darker truth of what transpired in the mountains of Pasargadae. The location of Cyrus's actual burial site was indeed lost. What tourists today visit as Cyrus's tomb in Pasargadae is actually an above-ground monument, a simple, elegant structure consisting of a stone chamber atop a stepped platform. This monument was built years after Cyrus's death and was likely meant as a memorial rather than an actual tomb, though it may have been designed to misdirect attention from the true burial site in the mountains. The truth remained buried until October 1961, when a team of Iranian and British archaeologists, conducting a survey of Achaemenid-era sites near Pasargadae, discovered an anomaly in the mountain bedrock. Ground-penetrating equipment suggested a void beneath the surface, a chamber system that didn't match any known Achaemenid architectural patterns. The excavation was slow and careful. When they finally breached the sealed entrance, a process that took 3 months of careful work, what they found matched ancient descriptions, but exceeded even the worst expectations. The antechamber was full of bones, human skeletons, 37 in total, scattered in positions that suggested panic, somewhere. Piled against the sealed entrance, others were spread throughout the chamber, a few were in the corridor leading to the burial chamber. Many showed signs of trauma, broken bones, crushed skulls, evidence of violence during those final moments, as men fought for air and space and life. But it was the burial chamber itself that represented the true archaeological nightmare. The sarcophagus at the center, presumably containing Cyrus's remains, had been partially destroyed by seismic activity over the centuries, but the 27 stone stalls carved into the walls were intact. In each stall stood a skeleton, not lying down, not collapsed, but standing, bones held upright by the confined space, positioned exactly as the horses had been on that day in 530 BC. The archaeologists' reports describe the scene in clinical terms that barely mask the horror. Equine remains in vertical orientation, with anterior hooves approximately 18 inches forward of posterior hooves, suggesting the animals maintained a standing position throughout the terminal period. The stall walls showed scratches and impact marks, evidence of the horses' attempts to escape. In several cases, pieces of skull bone were embedded in the stone, where the animals had struck their heads against the walls in their panic. Chemical analysis of residue found in the chamber confirmed the presence of the sedative herbs described in ancient texts, the drugs that had kept the horses docile enough to lead into their deaths, but not unconscious enough to spare them the suffering. Perhaps most haunting were the organic materials preserved by the tomb-sealed, dry environment. Fragments of decorated bridles still hanging from wall hooks, strands of horsehair, and most disturbingly, scraps of leather that had once been part of the horses' harnesses. One bridle was found to have an inscription in Old Persian, Shadow Runner, who carried the King of Kings. The archaeological team also found something unexpected, scratch marks on the inside of the stone doors that sealed each stall. Not from horses, their hooves couldn't have reached this position, but from human fingernails. Apparently, in their final, desperate moments, some of the trapped men had tried to open the stalls, either hoping the horses might somehow force open an escape route, or perhaps simply seeking to free the animals from their suffering. The discovery created an immediate ethical dilemma. The Iranian government, proud of its Persian heritage and eager to promote tourism at ancient sites, was deeply uncomfortable with the findings. This wasn't a story of ancient glory and civilization. It was evidence of institutionalized cruelty. of religious extremism turned into state policy. The excavation was quietly shut down. The site was sealed again, this time with concrete rather than stone. Official reports emphasized the archaeological value of the finds while minimizing the disturbing details. The human remains were given proper burial, but the horse skeletons were left in place. Disturbing them further seemed like a violation of a different kind. Dr. Sarah Mortensen, a British archaeologist who was part of the original 1961 team, and later published an unauthorized account of the discovery, wrote, "We had uncovered not just a tomb, but a time capsule of cruelty. Every detail of that chamber had been designed with one purpose, to maximize suffering while maintaining the appearance of honor. It was, in effect, a torture chamber disguised as a monument." Her book, The Standing Dead: Human Sacrifice in the Achaemenid Empire, was initially banned in Iran and remains controversial. The official position is that the burial was a tragic but sincere religious observance, not a deliberate act of cruelty. Critics argue this is historical revisionism, an attempt to sanitize an uncomfortable truth about one of history's most celebrated civilizations. The legal and cultural ramifications continue to this day. In 2015, animal rights activists in Iran used the story of Cyrus's tomb to argue for stricter protections against animal cruelty, pointing out that the same cultural traditions that permitted this ancient horror still influence contemporary attitudes toward animal welfare in some parts of Persian society. The debate remains heated and unresolved. The horror of Cyrus's tomb represents more than just an isolated incident of ancient cruelty. It reveals fundamental truths about the intersection of power, religion, and moral compromise that remain relevant 25 centuries later. First, it demonstrates how quickly civilizations can rationalize atrocity in the name of sacred duty. The Achaemenid Empire was, by the standards of its time, relatively enlightened. Cyrus himself is remembered for his tolerance of different religions and cultures, for his famous cylinder, now considered by some to be history's first declaration of human rights, and for his comparatively humane treatment of conquered peoples. Yet this same civilization, within days of his death, engaged in a coordinated act of cruelty that served no practical purpose and provided no tangible benefit. The progression is instructive. It began with religious authorities asserting special knowledge about cosmic requirements. This assertion was not questioned because questioning religious authority was socially unacceptable and legally dangerous. Once the framework was established that Cyrus needed these specific honors to properly enter the afterlife, each subsequent escalation became easier to justify. First, the horses. After all, they were property, valuable but ultimately replaceable. If the Magi said the cosmic balance demanded their sacrifice, who were common people to argue? Then, the men. The rationale was similar: secrecy was paramount, and the only way to ensure secrecy was to eliminate witnesses. Each step followed logically from the previous one, and each step made the next seem less shocking, less impossible. This pattern, authority claiming special insight, society accepting that claim uncritically, incremental escalation toward horror, appears repeatedly throughout history. We see it in the Inquisition, in the Khmer Rouge's Cambodia, in the Salem witch trials, in countless pogroms and genocides. The specifics change, but the structure remains. Someone claims to know what the gods or history or racial purity or national security requires, and once that claim is accepted, almost anything becomes justifiable. The Cyrus tomb also reveals something about institutional memory and historical truth. For 2,400 years, the official story of Cyrus's funeral was one of honor and appropriate mourning. The reality, the terror, the suffering, the betrayal of loyal servants, was erased. This erasure was deliberate, systematic, and largely successful. If not for archaeological chance and careful excavation, it would have remained permanent. This raises uncomfortable questions about other historical narratives. How many other glorious funerals, necessary sacrifices, and honorable traditions conceal similar horrors? How many ancient accounts of religious observances are actually records of institutional cruelty that time has laundered into respectability? In the decades following the 1961 discovery, several other burial sites from the Achaemenid period were investigated with new skepticism. A tomb complex near Susa yielded evidence of similar practices, though on a smaller scale. A noble's burial that included the remains of 3 horses and 7 human servants, all showing signs of having been buried alive. Excavations near Ecbatana found a royal tomb with chambers that appear to have been designed for living entombment, though whether they were actually used this way remains uncertain. These discoveries suggest that the horror of Cyrus's tomb was not entirely unique. It was part of a broader cultural practice that may have been more common than official histories indicated. The Achaemenid Empire, for all its achievements, participated in a tradition of human and animal sacrifice that it later worked systematically to conceal. The psychological impact on those who participated in these rituals is also worth considering. The men who sealed that tomb, Gaumata's guards, the priests who blessed the proceedings, even Cambyses II himself, had to live with what they had done. Some apparently couldn't. Historical records from the period mention an unusual number of suicides among the royal guard in the year following Cyrus's funeral. The court physician who prepared the sedative herbs for the horses disappeared into a monastery and never emerged. Gaumata's own trajectory is telling. His seizure of power less than a year after the funeral, his adoption of a false identity, his eventual violent death, all suggest a man unmoored from moral constraints. Once you've participated in horror on that scale and justified it as religious necessity, what other horrors become possible? Led that tomb weren't sadists. They were priests performing religious duties, soldiers following orders, officials serving the state. They likely believed they were honoring Cyrus, maintaining cosmic order, doing what duty demanded. This makes their actions more disturbing, not less. Evil is rarely simple. It doesn't usually announce itself as evil. More often, it comes dressed in the language of necessity, tradition, honor, or sacred duty. It asks reasonable people to do unreasonable things, one small compromise at a time, until the unthinkable becomes routine. The horses of Cyrus's tomb can't speak for themselves. Neither can the 37 men who died with them. But their bones tell a story that echoes across millennia, a warning about the human capacity for cruelty, especially when that cruelty can be wrapped in the language of honor and divine will. What do you think drove Gaumata and the Persian court to commit such acts in the name of religious duty? Was it genuine belief in cosmic necessity, or was there a darker political motivation at work? Leave your theories in the comments below. And here's something to consider. How many other glorious historical moments might conceal similar horrors? What other monuments and memorials might have foundations built on suffering we've chosen to forget? If this journey through history's darkest corners has intrigued you, subscribe to Fear Sermon for more lost chapters of ancient cruelty and forgotten horrors. Ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode. We're building a community of truth seekers who refuse to let history sanitize its own crimes. The past isn't always glorious. Sometimes it's terrifying, but it's always worth understanding. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another story that time tried to bury,